today's argument is quite interesting. We are on Friday, we are approaching the weekend, so what better thing to do than go over the past 7 years worth of raiding experiences and figure out an interesting concept. The concept that this is the hardest raid we have had in the past 7 years, and in the past grand total of like a dozen different raids. At the very least, this is what the numbers for now are saying. And we have them for today. We have a whole lot of numbers. However, initially, what these numbers are telling us is a completely different thing. Because when you look at how things have been going in, at the very least in Heroic Raid right now, in Liberation of Undermine, these are the numbers right now, 10 days into the release of this season. You can see that Chrome King Galliux has over 700 different heroic kills. Now, when you compare this to, for example, something like Heroic Sepulchre, that's 35 kills in Heroic of the Jailer after 10 days. That's not Mythic, by the way, that's Heroic. 35 kills. You have Sylvanas, the raid tier before that in Shadowlands, who only had 126. In Castornatria, to begin the expansion of Shadowlands, you had 471 of the Natrius. At the very beginning of last expansion, Dragonflight, you had only 239 kills of Heroic Razaget. Now, just looking at Heroic, it's not that this raid is looking like to be particularly difficult. Obviously, we're still not talking about being an absolute joke like the Emerald Nightmare in Heroic in Legion, or even the first raid of BFA, Uldir, which was also much easier in Heroic. So at least looking at Heroic difficulty, it does look like it is pretty fine as a difficulty. Now, some might say, well, but a lot of raids, including our first season in this expansion, have been coming out staggered. So obviously, if you have 1 full week worth of time to do normal and to do heroic before you get into mythic, it is likely you will have more participation in the heroic difficulty, right? Because of course, you have more time to prepare before mythic comes out. Well, in this case, in the case of Galliwix, the last boss of heroic, that's not even happening because this new season came out with normal, heroic and mythic all at the same time. So technically, if anything, you would have seen fewer kills of Galliwix in heroic since it came out at the same time as mythic, kind of like the opposite with Ansurek, which came out split from the mythic release when it was normal and heroic only at the beginning of this expansion. So what we have been seeing right now in mythic is a pretty interesting picture, because 10 days after the beginning of this season we currently are, this is the current situation in this raid. You have, of course, no kills of Galliwix, the 8th and last boss. You also have no kill of Magzi, the 7th boss of the raid, with currently 2 guilds working on this boss, Liquid and Echo. And then you have 2 kills, of course, of 1 armed bandit. You have 4 kills of Sprocket, Monger, Lock and Stock, and then 10 kills of Styx. Styx being the 4th boss of the raid. Now this is a new first, this is a new record, to have 10 days into a raid tier, only 10 kills of the 4th boss is very, very, very small. We have been checking all 7 years worth of 3.5 different expansions to see how much close do we have to go to see 10 boss kills after 10 days compared to the 4th boss of this raid. To put things in perspective, if you start all the way back from BFA, you already had 12 kills of Carapace of N'Zoth in Nyalota, the second to last boss of the raid. And by the way, that was a 12 boss raid tier. It wasn't even the 8 bosses we seem to be getting all the time now. That was a 12 boss raid, and by the time you got into 10 days of the tier, 11 bosses already died in Nyalota. In Eternal Palace, okay, fine, we are back to having only 8 bosses, but the situation was the same. You still had 12 guilds killing Zakul, the second to last boss of the tier 10 days in. BOD was even easier because Stormwall Blockade, the second to last boss before Jaina, had 17 kills. We are also not even gonna mention what happened in Uldir, because the kill count in there is in the dozens, if not the hundreds, because it was much easier than these 3, and these 3 still have worse numbers than Liberation on Undermine so far. The situation is not getting particularly better once you move into Shadowlands, because again, 10 days into the tier, you had the mid, what should have been the equivalent of this raid's mid block, which is Styx, which was Council of Blood. in Castle Natria, which wasn't even the 4th boss, by the way, it was a 7th boss, so a bit late to be a first block of the raid, but still, Council of Blood, 10 days in, still had 44 guilds defeating it. In fact, you would have to get to Sludge Fist, the 8th boss of the tier, to get a kill number similar to Styx, 12 guilds defeating Sludge Fist. And now we even get the entire raid tier being cleared, because by the time 10 guilds had defeated Styx in Liberation of Undermine, 2 guilds already finished the tier in Castle Natria. Sylvanas, despite the fight itself lasting 27 months, proved to be even easier, because 10 days into the season 5 different guilds had defeated Sylvanas. You also had 20 guilds 10 days in defeating Fate Scribe, and 32 guilds defeating the other, big first block of the raid, which was Painsmith. Now, can, however, Liberation of Undermine do even worse, so to speak, than what was considered up to now the toughest raid to date, which was Sepulcher, right? Because of the sheer amount of pools being sunk into Halondrus, and then Anduin, and then Raigelon, and then the Jailer. It was just a tour de force, it was just a nightmare gauntlet of difficult bosses. Well, up to Halondrus, things went pretty smoothly, and then 10 days in, 7 different guilds defeated Halondrus. You also had 3 different guilds defeating Anduin. No, sure, no guilds had actually cleared the raid by now, because you would have to wait practically another week to see the Jailer being defeated. It took about 17 days for the Jailer. It was the longest, and it still is the longest, of the times it took to clear a raid in the past 4 expansions. But even then, Halondrus was the 7th raid boss of the tier, not the 4th boss like Styx is. So just the fact that you have a comparable amount of clears to Halondrus for Styx is quite telling. Now, we move over to the latest expansion with Dragonflight. Things, I'm afraid, are not getting much better, because with Vault of the Incarnates, you had 20 guilds defeating Dathia after 10 days, and 12 guilds having defeated Kurog. You start getting into similar territory numbers to what we have now for Styx, with Broodkeeper Diurna, the second to last boss of Vault of the Incarnates. And yes, of course, 10 days into the tier, the raid had already been cleared twice, by Echo and by Liquid. Now, Aberrus, notoriously an easy raid, the easier of the raids in recent memory. You had the first actual block of the raid. That was early on as well, because Rashok was reasonably early this time, but still, 10 days in, you had 94 guilds defeating the boss. And then Zaskarn, despite all the memery around the cheeses and the strats planned for this boss, you still had 32 guilds defeating Zaskarn 10 days in, and then 12 guilds defeating Echo of Neltarion, with 5 different guilds having gone through Sarkaret in the first 10 days of the raid. And then you finish the expansion with Amir Josil. Now, Amir Josil got some Sepulcher vibes from the last 3 bosses, how backloaded in terms of difficulty the raid was, because the trio of Smolderon, Tindral, Farak was quite a nasty one. Yet, maybe our memory is a bit fuzzy and blurry, because by this point, 10 days into Amir Josil, you had 28 different guilds defeating Smolderon. That is far, far more, basically almost 3 times as much as the guilds who have defeated Styx right now. You also have Tindral, funnily enough, on the same level of difficulty as Sprocket Monger, because you have 3 guilds defeating Tindral 10 days into Amir Josil. Yes, to be fair, right now, Farak would have still been undefeated. Farak is about to die in a couple of days before next week's reset in Amir Josil. This then leaves us, of course, with our first season of the expansion, with Nerobar Palace as the first raid. Well, the first block of the raid, Rashanan, didn't turn out to be quite the first block. You had almost 600 guilds defeating Rashanan in the first 10 days. The actual first block, though, were the next 2, definitely, Brood Twister and Nexus Princess. So, 10 days in, you had 25 guilds defeating Brood Twister and 9 guilds defeating Nexus Princess, so barely 1 fewer than the amount of guilds who defeated Styx right now. And then you still had 5 guilds defeating Silken Court, and Queen Ansorek is about to die. In a couple of days, we're about to have the first kill of Ansorek. Now, this is worth pointing out that we have been comparing these differences in kills with the latest bosses of the raid, compared to Styx, which is the 4th boss of the raid. If we had to compare these numbers with Sprocket Monger, which is only the 5th boss of the raid, then only a very small handful of bosses would have still been alive by now. You would have gotten Ansurek, Ferak, Razageth, the Jailer, Denatrius, Nazot, Ajara, basically all of the last bosses, and then just Tindral and Anduin. Those would have been the only bosses killed less than Sprocket Monger. And then of course it gets even worse when you compare this to One Arm Bandit, and then of course the nothing for now of both Magzi and Galliwig. So this means that overall, for now, this raid tier is comfortably the most challenging so far that we have gotten in the past 7 years, 4 expansions, 11 raid tiers. Use whichever metric you want to use. That's the current level of difficulty we have right now. I mean, you know, we haven't heard perhaps nearly as much community reaction to this. I seem to remember way more players considering things like Tindral way more insane in terms of difficulty, or even Alondrus back in Shadowlands compared to what we have seen right now in this raid tier. Even though numbers at hand, this is what the kills in the raid are telling us, that the difficulty of this raid in Mythic, because remember, we just looked at the numbers in Heroic, and as far as Heroic difficulty is, it's fine. It's actually slightly easier than previous raid tiers. It's just where it gets much more challenging apparently is in Mythic. Now Blizzard of course seems to have gotten the message. They have already triple nerfed Styx in the past 3 days. First the HP nerf to all of the mobs, all of the enemies inside there, then another HP nerf on top of the HP nerf of the bombshells, and then less damage if you mess up and explode a bombshell, or the rockets from the adds have been lowered in damage as well. Of course, by this next reset you will have even more nerfs to try to make the progression more smooth for way more guilds. But for now, this has been the difficulty level in the raid, which has been very, very tough, as we have just seen. Numbers at hand, this is a quite challenging raid tier, and we're still just talking about the the 4th and 5th boss, which have been barely tested by something like 20 guilds at best right now. So that's the challenge level of this raid. Obviously this raid also has other things put into place, like for example this one is the first one after Nerobar Palace to have the stacking raid buff for damage and healing. So next reset, for example, you will have the global 3% buff to everyone that will go live. So of course it will get smoothened out quickly, faster than previous raid tiers, but for now it was worth pointing out that it's a very nasty, very difficult raid, despite not being too bad. You know, experiencing the bosses, they actually felt quite nice. I'm pretty excited about the later bosses down the tier as well. They don't seem to have particularly infernal mechanics like you had to engage with, like for example with Tindral or with Zaskarn, or things like the Jailer, or things like Kalondru. This seems to be an even better raid, just apparently for now quite the difficult one. But for today though, on this Friday, I'm gonna leave you to whatever you were planning to do on this weekend. We are now starting our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yeah, I don't mind it. You know, it's been 3-4 days almost by now that it has kept raining. It's cool, it's cool. If we can keep this temperature up until mid-June, it would be quite appreciated.